The Legend of Zelda is one prominent franchise that sold tens of millions of copies for Nintendo over the decades, with nearly each video game release feeling like a major event taking place in the gaming industry. It's a sentiment that most other game developers and publishers could only imagine, spawning shirts, plushies, sequels, replicas of in-game items both officially and unofficially, along with all other kinds of toys and media being made in celebration. And that's just for Ocarina of Time alone. Whether you're a hardcore gamer or not, there's little doubt you've heard of The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time at some point in your lifetime. I want to take a look back at this all-time gaming classic as we finally hit upon its 20-year anniversary. Originally experimenting with making Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link in polygonal form using the Super Nintendo's Super FX chip, Yoshiaki Koizumi, a director and designer of Ocarina of Time who also worked on previous Nintendo titles, wished to realize Chanbara-style swordplay in 3D game format. Chanbara, literally meaning sword-fighting movies, is a subgenre of period dramas and is often looked at as being similar to westerns in how its fighting and drama is portrayed in cinema. This became a heavy influence for huge releases such as Star Wars, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, as well as the aforementioned Ocarina of Time for its combat system. Along with the idea of cinematic gameplay at the forefront, Nintendo was speculated to be attempting to produce CGI on par with supercomputers for its time in the early development stages of the Nintendo 64, which at the time was codenamed Project Reality.
Leagues beyond any currently available or anticipated hardware, Project Reality will bring to home video players the same types of astounding visual effects seen in movies, like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. When this technology is made interactive, players won't just watch their TV screens, they'll dive headfirst right through them.
When finally unveiled to the public on November 24th, 1995, the console was introduced as the Nintendo Ultra 64 at the 7th Annual Shoshinkai Software Exhibition in Japan, with only tech demos being shown and no real gameplay.
This is another real-time Nintendo Ultra 64 environment featuring a shark we call Baz. Notice there are no blocks, no artifacts, no matter how close we get. Everything retains its natural texture.
Parce que ça fait 2 fois plus que la Saturn ou la PlayStation, 2 fois plus de bits pour le microprocesseur.
On the Shoshinkai exhibition in the very next year, various classic Nintendo games like Super Mario 64 were finally announced and with gameplay to show. This is the first time we would see The Legend of Zelda in a 3D format as well, albeit in a state that most fans don't exactly recognize, and is clearly only shown off as a tech demo. It was also meant to initially release for the ultimately unsuccessful Nintendo 64 disk drive, a peripheral that was also still in development. As you can probably guess by now, the Shoshinkai exhibition was quite the mainstay for getting an early look at Nintendo's latest and greatest games, as well as technology showings. For their presentation in 1996, only 2 years prior to Ocarina of Time's release, they finally showed off genuine gameplay of the game, even if it was still very early in development. While clearly appearing different in many ways from its final release, an editor at Nintendo Power still seemed to express some emotions of surprise and possibly skepticism of its technology in an interview with Mr. Miyamoto, stating, "I couldn't believe that those amazing characters were in the actual game. I thought images like those were only possible with development equipment." For the next year or so, Nintendo actively released screenshots showing different stages of Ocarina of Time's development, which still looked largely different from its final release, including mechanics and environments not seen, such as third-person bow and arrow usage, that had driven fans to create mods attempting to recreate what was shown. At some point in early concept, Yoshiaki Koizumi asked Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of the huge Nintendo franchises including Mario and Zelda, about how they should make The Legend of Zelda for the Nintendo 64. Miyamoto proposed a first-person perspective that would change back to a side perspective when encountering an enemy. Toru Osawa, a script director of Ocarina of Time, said that it wasn't visually interesting and reportedly abandoned it right away. It wasn't until the E3 showcase in 1997 would we see the recognizable form of Ocarina of Time being played in real time. While there were minor differences then in the final release, this was, for the most part, Ocarina of Time as we know it, shown in its full glory, first time for the public to watch. While Ocarina of Time never released alongside the 64-disc drive peripheral as originally intended, Shigeru Miyamoto still kept it in mind, saying Ocarina of Time has been designed with the disc drive system in mind, and indicated that the new content may arrive, also mentioning, "There were several ideas that I could not incorporate in the current game because of the time shortage and other reasons. In the future, I want some new areas and new dungeons to be available for the players who have already finished Ocarina of Time, where they will find new challenges." Alas, the Nintendo 64 disc drive ended up in failure in Japan, the only country it released in, and all plans for a release involving Ocarina of Time was cancelled due to commercial failure. While Ocarina of Time had quite the development history, going from concepts of Zelda 2 in first person to what we have today, it was always based around a similar formula that The Legend of Zelda was always known for. You, the player, play as Link, a hero tasked with trying to stop the evils of Ganondorf while saving Hyrule and its princess, Zelda, using pieces of an ancient relic known as the Triforce. However, with an all-new three-dimensional environment and set of game mechanics not yet seen in the franchise, it's a framework that could have resulted in a sloppy pseudo-conversion of its acclaimed 2D counterparts, something that's occurred with many classic franchises since the 3D era came into fruition. But Ocarina of Time's success says otherwise. Ocarina of Time received critical acclaim and strong commercial success worldwide with over 500,000 pre-orders in the US, more than tripling the number of any game before it, and selling over 1 million copies in less than a week of its November release in 1998. The game was an instant classic with perfect scores by major gaming publications like GameSpot, Famitsu, and IGN. While there were some minor criticisms about the sound and graphics by some publications, reception was by and large phenomenal. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time follows courageous, everlasting hero of the franchise, Link, as he's awoken by his fairy companion, Navi, from an obscure nightmare about a mysterious man in black armor pursuing a young girl on horseback. After Navi brings the young boy back to the Great Deku Tree, also known as the guardian of the Kokiri Forest, the tree tells Link of Ganondorf, a wicked man of the desert, who cursed the tree, seeks to conquer the world, and states that Link must stop him. As a player quests throughout the land of Hyrule, Link must solve puzzles and defeat enemies in order to progress. First doing so by destroying the root of the Great Deku Tree's curse, a parasite known as Queen Goma. After defeating this parasite, the Great Deku Tree tells of Ganondorf's motives, how the Triforce was created, and directs Link to meet Princess Zelda at Hyrule Castle outside of the forest. As a last gesture to help save the world, the Great Deku Tree entrusts Link with the Kokiri's Emerald, the spiritual stone of the forest, before finally passing on. Being awed by the sights and sounds, a huge landscape with an outstanding musical score accompanying it presents itself. This is what Miyamoto wanted to make sure the player experiences when Link exits Kokiri Forest and enters Hyrule Field. While field designer Makoto Miyanaga stated that in the beginning, Hyrule Field was terribly uninteresting. Various technical effects were implemented to add a sense of atmosphere. Getting the sun to rise, then set, followed by a moon, was a challenge for the developers. So was getting the correct color tones. All struggles were worth it in the end, however, giving Hyrule Field a sense of temperature, wind, and atmosphere. No small feat for the time of release. Immersion wasn't the only thing players felt, however, when entering Hyrule Field. Unlike Kokiri Forest, Hyrule Field was open and, being the overworld of the game, connected to all kinds of large and mysterious areas to explore. I think it's safe to say that many players felt a sense of freedom and openness not experienced in many 3D games at the time. Once the player progresses enough in the game, Link must go to the Temple of Time, where he uses the Ocarina of Time instrument and his spiritual stones retrieved from the various dungeons in order to open the door to the Sacred Realm. It is here Link finds the iconic and well-known Master Sword, but as he pulls it from its pedestal, Ganondorf, having snuck into the temple after Link, appears and claims the Triforce. Link is then shown once again, only this time much older than before, 7 years older to be precise. The decision to have two versions of Link, a young version and an adult one, was done during the process of trying to decide which model of Link to use. Miyamoto stated in an interview with Kotaku, "We started off creating the more grown-up model of Link. After creating that model, we then asked, well, what if we were to create a younger Link? Then we asked, which one should we go with? When we created the younger Link, that's when we realized we could use both versions of Link and have him grow from being a child to being a grown-up. In order to create contrast between the two versions of Link and Ocarina of Time, the characters of the game were impacted as well. I wanted to make sure we had something that felt a little bit simpler in terms of the differences between the world that Link experiences as a child and the world he experiences as an adult. For example, you would see how his relationship to the girls in the game would change from when he was a boy and when he was an adult. When you were a child, certain characters might have been scary, or the adults who seemed stupid. How did you see them when you were a child? It was about portraying differences between those two and tell the story of a boy growing up. And once that boy does grow up, going back to the story of Ocarina of Time, Rauru, one of the 7 sages, greets Link in the Sacred Realm, explaining that Link's spirit was sealed for 7 years until he was old enough to wield the Master Sword to defeat Ganondorf, who has now taken over Hyrule. Rauru also mentions of a way to imprison Ganondorf, involving the other sages. When Link is returned to the Temple of Time, a mysterious figure known as Sheik appears, guiding Link to free 5 temples from Ganondorf's control, ultimately allowing each temple's sage to awaken. Following these bits of story, the player is once again in control of Link, but this time, all grown up. With Nintendo's aptitude for pushing innovative gameplay in their franchises, The Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2, and A Link to the Past all had their fair share of drastic gameplay reworkings that were suited for the games that they were. But with 3D rendering technology becoming the forefront and completely redesigning the game from the ground up, Nintendo had reached their technical pinnacle with Ocarina of Time. The combat system was arguably revolutionary, with its simple, yet still often challenging mechanics that make you, the player, feel like a hero going into battle with many weapons at your disposal and various forms of enemies to contend with. This feeling was only enhanced after you acquired the all-important Master Sword and face against even more powerful enemies. A true Zelda game also needs to have many different weapons that have sincere utility in its combat, and Ocarina of Time is no exception. A typical Zelda game includes many weapons, such as the bow and arrows, boomerangs, bombs, potions, and some forms of magic. Ocarina of Time pushes this to its limits, however, by not only including those same items, but also by including weaponry never seen before and ramping it all to a greater scale. You didn't just throw bombs to see enemies disappear after a 2D explosion. You threw bombs into the mouth of a gigantic reptile to make him weak so you can further attack him. This same sense of scale applies to much of the rest of the game, especially so with its bosses. Ocarina of Time's weapons are outstanding for their uses, carrying out a balance between quantity and quality. Abundant enough to satisfy the desire of any observing gamer, and powerful enough with great enough utility to keep players wanting to use them more. With many battles feeling like a truly cinematic event taking place, it was a combat system that wasn't seen before, at least not on this epic of a scale. Of course, all this weaponry would be meaningless without any form of real challenge to make the player feel like they're doing anything important. Without challenge, the game would just feel like a Zelda game where you're just going through the motions until the end of the game. In a Zelda game, the challenge mainly comes from the dungeons with the puzzles and combat options they offer. Ocarina of Time offers these in spades, and in some cases arguably add too much challenge, especially in the infamous dungeon, the Water Temple, a dungeon the player needs to navigate through during the game to restore Lake Hylia to its natural state. This dungeon requires a lot of awareness of the temple itself and can be quite challenging for a newcomer to beat. With having to navigate a lot of small areas and tight corridors, combined with trying to keep in mind of where you are vertically as well, it can get complicated quickly. Add on to that, the fact you need to go into and out of your inventory nearly every time you want to go in and out of the water, and that's how you get a director apologizing for the notoriety the Water Temple accrued 11 years later. Luckily for the players of Ocarina of Time, Shigeru Miyamoto grew up obsessed with the Wild West. Similarly to how Chanbara-style fighting inspired the team to make Ocarina of Time's combat mechanics in the way that they did, there's inspiration to be had from the common Western themes as well. As a child, Miyamoto took aluminum cups from water fountains and pounded them against concrete in a clip-clop rhythm which, to Miyamoto, sounded similar to horses galloping across open plains. So, to go along with the new epic scale that Ocarina of Time sets out to achieve, a brand new, huge overworld was incorporated to explore. Not only does it cleverly connect with all the zones efficiently, but it also has one of the franchise's most memorable staples beginnings right in the middle of it, Epona. While Link visits the Lon Lon Ranch as a child, a young girl by the name of Malon introduces him to a young horse named Epona. During this encounter, Link must learn Epona's song from Malon to call said pony to him. After the 7-year period this game skips in the story, players find Epona, now an adult horse, owned by a corrupt employee who gains Ganondorf's favor to be in control of the ranch. After Link earns the right to take Epona by beating this man in a race. He attempts to thwart Link by shutting the ranch gates, hoping to entrap Link and Epona. Link gets around this, however, by jumping over a fence going to Hyrule Field using Epona, and thus, the stage is set for the player to explore the world with a majestic horse that's still held in high regard to this day. To many players, she's not just a horse to go from point A to point B, but a true companion who sticks with you in both the early and late parts of the game. A companion that plays a principal role for the rest of the franchise. While this game's not quite as open as previous installments of the series, it's certainly more accessible to players who might not be used to the Legend of Zelda games. Having clear objectives and direction for the player is often debated as to whether it's better or worse design overall in many games and franchises, but it's still not tremendously linear anyway. You can still complete the game's temples, which are primary objectives to complete the game, in a different order than you would expect, being only restricted by the items you have, and you can certainly do various side objectives at just about any time you desire. This allows for a similar sense of freedom to the other Zelda games, while still being easily approachable if you've never played a Legend of Zelda game before. Accessibility is also a part of the Zelda franchise that's been somewhat of a mixed bag. While the games have always been easy to pick up and play overall, design choices like lengthy beginnings and lack of direction have definitely contributed to a sense of mystery. In some ways this is great, but it can also make it difficult to progress for newcomers or can be an annoyance for multiple playthroughs. Ocarina of Time refines this by having the aforementioned semi-linearity and a significantly quicker starting period than previous entries. Even though players had to get used to the new controls for a game designed for 3 dimensions, the process was still largely intuitive to learn by having various NPCs and clear but small actions to do while trying to get to your first dungeon. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time would ultimately become a classic many years later, with many journalists and independent YouTubers putting the game #1 for all-time best games lists, being heavily revisited afterward, and being a critically acclaimed relic in the history of video games as a whole. Ocarina of Time would be re-released for GameCube in a bundle with its sequel during 2003, and remastered on the Nintendo 3DS on June 16, 2011. Both versions offered serviceable ways to re-experience Nintendo's epic, and in doing so also accrued quite the sales count for the game, with the 3DS version alone selling over 1 million copies worldwide in less than a week, being the third 3DS title to do so. Clearly, players continue to seek out this game for all it has to offer, and while this mini-documentary, if you will, is much shorter than I would like it to be, I hope I have shown you at least some of the reasons why. I don't expect much, but for anyone who's watching, always remember to have fun.